Section 2 of All the Sad Young Men by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by SKVeld. The Rich Boy continued. 5. In 1922, when Anson went abroad with the junior partner to investigate some London loans, the journey intimated that he was to be taken into the firm. He was 27 now, a little heavy without being definitely stout, and with a manner older than his years. Old people and young people liked him and trusted him, and mothers felt safe when their daughters were in his charge. For he had a way, when he came into a room, of putting himself on a footing with the oldest and most conservative people there. "You and I," he seemed to say, "we're solid. We understand." He had an instinctive and rather charitable knowledge of the weaknesses of men and women, and, like a priest, it made him the more concerned for the maintenance of outward forms. It was typical of him that every Sunday morning he taught in a fashionable Episcopal Sunday school, even though a cold shower and a quick change into a cutaway coat were all that separated him from the wild night before. After his father's death, he was the practical head of his family, and, in effect, guided the destinies of the younger children. Through a complication, his authority did not extend to his father's estate, which was administered by his Uncle Robert, who was the horsey member of the family, a good-natured, hard-drinking member of that set which centres about Wheatley Hills. Uncle Robert and his wife, Edna, had been great friends of Anson's youth, and the former was disappointed when his nephew's superiority failed to take a horsey form. He backed him for a city club which was the most difficult in America to enter. One could only join if one's family had helped to build up New York, or, in other words, were rich before 1880. And when Anson, after his election, neglected it for the Yale Club, Uncle Robert gave him a little talk on the subject. But when on top of that Anson declined to enter Robert Hunter's own conservative and somewhat neglected brokerage house, his manner grew cooler. Like a primary teacher who has taught all he knew, he slipped out of Anson's life. There were so many friends in Anson's life, scarcely one for whom he had not done some unusual kindness, and scarcely one whom he did not occasionally embarrass by his bursts of rough conversation or his habit of getting drunk whenever and however he liked. It annoyed him when anyone else blundered in that regard. About his own lapses, he was always humorous. Odd things happened to him, and he told them with infectious laughter. I was working in New York that spring, and I used to lunch with him at the Yale Club, which my university was sharing until the completion of our own. I had read of Paula's marriage, and one afternoon, when I asked him about her, something moved him to tell me the story. After that, he frequently invited me to family dinners at his house, and behaved as though there was a special relation between us, as though, with his confidence, a little of that consuming memory had passed into me. I found that despite the trusting mothers, his attitude toward girls was not indiscriminately protective. It was up to the girl. If she showed an inclination towards looseness, she must take care of herself, even with him. "Life," he would explain sometimes, "has made a cynic of me." By life, he meant Paula. Sometimes, especially when he was drinking, it became a little twisted in his mind, and he thought that she had callously thrown him over. This cynicism, or rather his realization that naturally fast girls were not worth sparing, led to his affair with Dolly Carger. It wasn't his only affair in those years, but it came nearest to touching him deeply, and it had a profound effect upon his attitude toward life. Dolly was the daughter of a notorious publicist who had married into society. She herself grew up into the junior league, came out at the plaza, and went to the assembly, and only a few old families like the Hunters could question whether or not she belonged, for her picture was often in the papers, and she had more enviable attention than many girls who undoubtedly did. She was dark-haired, with carmine lips and a high, lovely color, which she concealed under pinkish-gray powder all through the first year out, because high color was unfashionable. Victorian pale was the thing to be. She wore black, severe suits and stood with her hands in her pockets, leaning a little forward, with a humorous restraint on her face. She danced exquisitely, better than anything she liked to dance, better than anything except making love. Since she was 10, she had always been in love, and usually with some boy who didn't respond to her. Those who did, and there were many, bored her after a brief encounter, but for her failures, she reserved the warmest spot in her heart. When she met them, she would always try once more. Sometimes she succeeded, more often she failed. It never occurred to this gypsy of the unattainable that there was a certain resemblance in those who refused to love her. They shared a hard intuition that saw through to her weakness, not a weakness of emotion, but a weakness of rudder. Anson perceived this when he first met her, less than a month after Paula's marriage. He was drinking rather heavily, and he pretended for a week that he was falling in love with her. Then he dropped her abruptly and forgot. Immediately he took up the commanding position in her heart. Like so many girls of that day, Dolly was slackly and indiscreetly wild. The unconventionality of a slightly older generation had been simply one facet of a post-war movement to discredit obsolete manners. Dolly's was both older and shabbier, and she saw in Anson the two extremes which the emotionally shiftless woman seeks, an abandon to indulgence alternating with a protective strength. In his character, she felt both the sybarite and the solid rock, and these two satisfied every need of her nature. She felt that it was going to be difficult, but she mistook the reason. She thought that Anson and his family expected a more spectacular marriage, but she guessed immediately that her advantage lay in his tendency to drink. They met at the large debutante dances, but as her infatuation increased, they managed to be more and more together. Like most mothers, Mrs. Carger believed that Anson was exceptionally reliable, so she allowed Dolly to go with him to distant country clubs and suburban houses without inquiring closely into their activities or questioning her explanations when they came in late. At first, these explanations might have been accurate, but Dolly's worldly ideas of capturing Anson were soon engulfed in the rising sweep of her emotion. Kisses in the back of taxis and motor cars were no longer enough. They did a curious thing. They dropped out of their world for a while and made another world just beneath it, where Anson's tippling and Dolly's irregular hours would be less noticed and commented on. It was composed, this world, of varying elements. Several of Anson's Yale friends and their wives, 2 or 3 young brokers and bond salesmen, and a handful of unattached men, fresh from college, with money and a propensity to dissipation. What this world lacked in spaciousness and scale, it made up for by allowing them a liberty that scarcely permitted itself. Moreover, it centered around them, and permitted Dolly the pleasure of a faint condescension, a pleasure which Anson, whose whole life was a condescension from the certitudes of his childhood, was unable to share. He was not in love with her, and in the long feverish winter of their affair he frequently told her so. In the spring he was weary. He wanted to renew his life at some other source. Moreover, he saw that either he must break with her now or accept the responsibility of a definite seduction. Her family's encouraging attitude precipitated his decision. One evening, when Mr. Carger knocked discreetly at the library door to announce that he had left a bottle of old brandy in the dining room, Anson felt that life was hemming him in. That night, he wrote her a short letter in which he told her that he was going on his vacation and that in view of all the circumstances, they had better meet no more. It was June. His family had closed up the house and gone to the country, so he was living temporarily at the Yale Club. I had heard about his affair with Dolly as it developed, accounts salted with humor, for he despised unstable women and granted them no place in the social edifice in which he believed. And when he told me that night that he was definitely breaking with her, I was glad. I had seen Dolly here and there, and each time with a feeling of pity at the hopelessness of her struggle, and of shame at knowing so much about her that I had no right to know. She was what is known as a pretty little thing, but there was a certain recklessness which rather fascinated me. Her dedication to the goddess of waste would have been less obvious had she been less spirited. She would most certainly throw herself away, but I was glad when I heard that the sacrifice would not be consummated in my sight. Anson was going to leave the letter of farewell at her house next morning. It was one of the few houses left open in the Fifth Avenue district, and he knew that the Cargers, acting upon erroneous information from Dolly, had foregone a trip abroad to give their daughter her chance. As he stepped out the door of the Yale Club into Madison Avenue, the postman passed him, and he followed back inside. The first letter that caught his eye was in Dolly's hand. He knew what it would be, a lonely and tragic monologue, full of the reproaches he knew, the invoked memories, the I wonder ifs, all the immemorial intimacies that he had communicated to Paula Legendre in what seemed another age. Thumbing over some bills, he brought it on top again and opened it. To his surprise, it was a short, somewhat formal note, which said that Dolly would be unable to go to the country with him for the weekend because Perry Hull from Chicago had unexpectedly come to town. It added that Anson had brought this on himself. If I felt that you loved me as I love you, I would go with you at any time, any place. But Perry is so nice, and he so much wants me to marry him. Anson smiled contemptuously. He had had experience with such decoy epistles. Moreover, he knew how Dolly had labored over this plan, probably sent for the faithful Perry and calculated the time of his arrival, even labored over the note so that it would make him jealous without driving him away. Like most compromises, it had neither force nor vitality, but only a timorous despair. Suddenly, he was angry. He sat down in the lobby and read it again. Then he went to the phone, called Dolly, and told her in his clear, compelling voice that he had received her note and would call for her at 5 o'clock as they had previously planned. Scarcely waiting for the pretended uncertainty of her, "Perhaps I can see you for an hour," he hung up the receiver and went down to his office. On the way, he tore his own letter into bits and dropped it in the street. He was not jealous. She meant nothing to him. But at her pathetic ruse, everything stubborn and self-indulgent in him came to the surface. It was a presumption from a mental inferior, and it could not be overlooked. If she wanted to know to whom she belonged, she would see. He was on the doorstep at 5:15. Dolly was dressed for the street, and he listened in silence to the paragraph of, "I can only see you for an hour," which she had begun on the phone. "Put your hat on, Dolly," he said. "We'll take a walk." They strolled up Madison Avenue and over to Fifth, while Anson's shirt dampened upon his portly body in the deep heat. He talked little, scolding her, making no love to her, but before they had walked 6 blocks, she was his again, apologizing for the note, offering not to see Perry at all as an atonement, offering anything. She thought that he had come because he was beginning to love her. "I'm hot," he said when they reached 71st Street. "This is a winter suit. If I stop by the house and change, would you mind waiting for me downstairs? I'll only be a minute." She was happy. The intimacy of his being hot, of any physical fact about him, thrilled her. When they came to the iron-grated door and Anson took out his key, she experienced a sort of delight. Downstairs, it was dark, and after he ascended in the lift, Dolly raised a curtain and looked out through opaque lace at the houses over the way. She heard the lift machinery stop, and with the notion of teasing him, pressed the button that brought it down. Then, on what was more than an impulse, she got into it and sent it up to what she guessed was his floor. "Anson!" she called, laughing a little. "Just a minute," he answered from his bedroom. Then, after a brief delay, "Now you can come in." He had changed and was buttoning his vest. "This is my room," he said lightly. "How do you like it?" She caught sight of Paula's picture on the wall, and stared at it in fascination, just as Paula had stared at the pictures of Anson's childish sweethearts 5 years before. She knew something about Paula. Sometimes she tortured herself with fragments of the story. Suddenly she came close to Anson, raising her arms. They embraced. Outside the area window, a soft artificial twilight already hovered, though the sun was still bright on a back roof across the way. In half an hour, the room would be quite dark. The uncalculated opportunity overwhelmed them, made them both breathless, and they clung more closely. It was imminent, inevitable. Still holding one another, they raised their heads. Their eyes fell together upon Paula's picture, staring down at them from the wall. Suddenly, Anson dropped his arms and, sitting down at his desk, tried the drawer with a bunch of keys. "Like a drink?" he asked in a gruff voice. "No, Anson." He poured himself half a tumbler of whiskey, swallowed it, and then opened the door into the hall. "Come on," he said. Dolly hesitated. "Anson, I'm going to the country with you tonight after all. You understand that, don't you?" "Of course," he answered brusquely. In Dolly's car, they rode on to Long Island, closer in their emotions than they had ever been before. They knew what would happen, not with Paula's face to remind them that something was lacking, but when they were alone in the still, hot Long Island night, they did not care. The estate in Port Washington, where they were to spend the weekend, belonged to a cousin of Anson's who had married a Montana copper operator. An interminable drive began at the lodge and twisted under imported poplar saplings toward a huge, pink Spanish house. Anson had often visited there before. After dinner, they danced at the Lynx Club. About midnight, Anson assured himself that his cousins would not leave before 2. Then he explained that Dolly was tired. He would take her home and return to the dance later. Trembling a little with excitement, they got into a borrowed car together and drove to Port Washington. As they reached the lodge, he stopped and spoke to the night watchman. "When are you making a round, Carl?" "Right away." "Then you will be in here till everybody's in?" "Yes, sir." "All right. Listen, if any automobile, no matter whose it is, turns in at this gate, I want you to phone the house immediately." He put a $5 bill into Carl's hand. "Is that clear?" "Yes, Mr. Anson." Being of the old world, he neither winked nor smiled. Yet Dolly sat with her face turned slightly away. Anson had a key. Once inside, he poured a drink for both of them. Dolly left hers untouched. Then he ascertained definitely the location of the phone and found that it was within easy hearing distance of their rooms, both of which were on the first floor. 5 minutes later, he knocked at the door of Dolly's room. "Anson?" He went in, closing the door behind him. She was in bed, leaning up anxiously with elbows on the pillow. Sitting beside her, he took her in his arms. "Anson, darling." He didn't answer. "Anson, Anson, I love you. Say you love me. Say it now. Can't you say it now, even if you don't mean it?" He did not listen. Over her head, he perceived that the picture of Paula was hanging here, upon this wall. He got up and went close to it. The frame gleamed faintly with thrice-reflected moonlight. Within, there was a blurred shadow of a face that he saw he did not know. Almost sobbing, he turned around and stared with abomination at the little figure on the bed. "This is all foolishness," he said thickly. "I don't know what I was thinking about. I don't love you, and you'd better wait for somebody that loves you. I don't love you a bit. Can't you understand?" His voice broke, and he went hurriedly out. Back in the salon, he was pouring himself a drink with uneasy fingers when the front door opened and suddenly his cousin came in. "Why, Anson, I hear Dolly's sick," she began solicitously. "I hear she's sick." "It was nothing," he interrupted, raising his voice so that it would carry into Dolly's room. She was a little tired. She went to bed. For a long time afterward, Anson believed that a protective God sometimes interfered in human affairs. But Dolly Carger, lying awake and staring at the ceiling, never again believed in anything at all. 6. When Dolly married during the following autumn, Anson was in London on business. Like Paula's marriage, it was sudden, but it affected him in a different way. At first he felt that it was funny, and had an inclination to laugh when he thought of it. Later it depressed him. It made him feel old. There was something repetitive about it. Why, Paula and Dolly had belonged to different generations. He had a foretaste of the sensation of a man of 40 who hears that the daughter of an old flame has married. He wired congratulations, and, as was not the case with Paula, they were sincere. He had never really hoped that Paula would be happy. When he returned to New York, he was made a partner in the firm, and as his responsibilities increased, he had less time on his hands. The refusal of a life insurance company to issue him a policy made such an impression on him that he stopped drinking for a year and claimed that he felt better physically, though I think he missed the convivial recounting of those Cellini-esque adventures which in his early 20s had played such a part of his life. But he never abandoned the Yale Club. He was a figure there, a personality, and the tendency of his class, who were now 7 years out of college, to drift away to more sober haunts, was checked by his presence. His day was never too full, nor his mind too weary to give any sort of aid to anyone who asked it. What had been done at first through pride and superiority had become a habit and a passion. And there was always something. A younger brother in trouble at New Haven, a quarrel to be patched up between a friend and his wife, a position to be found for this man, an investment for that. But his specialty was the solving of problems for young married people. Young married people fascinated him, and their apartments were almost sacred to him. He knew the story of their love affair, advised them where to live and how, and remembered their babies' names. Toward young wives, his attitude was circumspect. He never abused the trust which their husbands, strangely enough, in view of his unconcealed irregularities, invariably reposed in him. He came to take a vicarious pleasure in happy marriages, and to be inspired to an almost equally pleasant melancholy by those that went astray. Not a season passed that he did not witness the collapse of an affair that perhaps he himself had fathered. When Paula was divorced and almost immediately remarried to another Bostonian, he talked about her to me all one afternoon. He would never love anyone as he had loved Paula, but he insisted that he no longer cared. "I'll never marry," he came to say. "I've seen too much of it, and I know a happy marriage is a very rare thing. Besides, I'm too old." But he did believe in marriage. Like all men who spring from a happy and successful marriage, he believed in it passionately. Nothing he had seen would change his belief. His cynicism dissolved upon it like air. But he did really believe he was too old. At 28, he began to accept with equanimity the prospect of marrying without romantic love. He resolutely chose a New York girl of his own class, pretty, intelligent, congenial, above reproach, and set about falling in love with her. The things he had said to Paula with sincerity, to other girls with grace, he could no longer say at all without smiling, or with the force necessary to convince. "When I'm 40, he told his friends, "I'll be ripe. I'll fall for some chorus girl like the rest." Nevertheless, he persisted in his attempt. His mother wanted to see him married, and he could now well afford it. He had a seat on the stock exchange, and his earned income came to $25,000 a year. The idea was agreeable. When his friends, he spent most of his time with the set he and Dolly had evolved, closed themselves in behind domestic doors at night, he no longer rejoiced in his freedom. He even wondered if he should have married Dolly. Not even Paula had loved him more, and he was learning the rarity, in the single life, of encountering true emotion. Just as this mood began to creep over him, a disquieting story reached his ear. His Aunt Edna, a woman just this side of 40, was carrying on an open intrigue with a dissolute, hard-drinking young man named Carrie Sloane. Everyone knew of it, except Anson's Uncle Robert, who for 15 years had talked long in clubs and taken his wife for granted. Anson heard the story again and again with increasing annoyance. Something of his old feeling for his uncle came back to him, a feeling that was more than personal, a reversion toward that family solidarity on which he had based his pride. His intuition singled out the essential point of the affair, which was that his uncle shouldn't be hurt. It was his first experiment in unsolicited meddling, but with his knowledge of Edna's character, he felt that he could handle the matter better than a district judge or his uncle. His uncle was in Hot Springs. Anson traced down the sources of the scandal so that there should be no possibility of mistake, and then he called Edna and asked her to lunch with him at the plaza next day. Something in his tone must have frightened her, for she was reluctant, but he insisted, putting off the date until she had no excuse for refusing. She met him at the appointed time in the plaza lobby, a lovely, faded, gray-eyed blonde in a coat of Russian sable. 5 great rings, cold with diamonds and emeralds, sparkled on her slender hands. It occurred to Anson that it was his father's intelligence and not his uncle's that had earned the fur and the stones, the rich brilliance that buoyed up her passing beauty. Though Edna scented his hostility, she was unprepared for the directness of his approach. "Edna, I'm astonished at the way you've been acting," he said in a strong, frank voice. "At first I couldn't believe it." "Believe what?" she demanded sharply. "You needn't pretend with me, Edna. I'm talking about Carrie Sloane. Aside from any other consideration, I didn't think you could treat Uncle Robert. Now look here, Anson," she began angrily, but his peremptory voice broke through hers. "And your children in such a way. You've been married 18 years, and you're old enough to know better." "You can't talk to me like that, you—" "Yes, I can. Uncle Robert has always been my best friend." He was tremendously moved. He felt a real distress about his uncle, about his 3 young cousins. Edna stood up, leaving her crab flake cocktail untasted. "This is the silliest thing. Very well, if you won't listen to me, I'll go to Uncle Robert and tell him the whole story. He's bound to hear it sooner or later, and afterward I'll go to old Moses Sloane." Edna faltered back into her chair. "Don't talk so loud," she begged him, her eyes blurred with tears. "You have no idea how your voice carries. You might have chosen a less public place to make all these crazy accusations." He didn't answer. "Oh, you never liked me, I know," she went on. "You're just taking advantage of some silly gossip to try and break up the only interesting friendship I've ever had. What did I ever do to make you hate me so?" Still, Anson waited. There would be the appeal to his chivalry, then to his pity, finally to his superior sophistication. When he had shouldered his way through all these, there would be admissions, and he could come to grips with her. By being silent, by being impervious, and by returning constantly to his main weapon, which was his own true emotion, he bullied her into frantic despair as the luncheon hour slipped away. At 2:00, she took out a mirror and a handkerchief, shined away the marks of her tears, and powdered the slight hollows where they had lain. She had agreed to meet him at her own house at 5. When he arrived, she was stressed on a chaise-longue, which was covered with cretonne for the summer, and the tears he had called up at luncheon seemed still to be standing in her eyes. Then he was aware of Carrie Sloane's dark, anxious presence upon the cold hearth. "What's this idea of yours?" broke out Sloane immediately. "I understand you invited Edna to lunch and then threatened her on the basis of some cheap scandal?" Anson sat down. "I have no reason to think it's only scandal. I hear you're going to take it to Robert Hunter, and to my father." Anson nodded. Either you break it off, or I will, he said. What goddamned business is it of yours, Hunter? Don't lose your temper, Carrie, said Edna nervously. It's only a question of showing him how absurd. For one thing, it's my name that's being handed around, interrupted Anson. That's all that concerns you, Carrie. Edna isn't a member of your family. She most certainly is. His anger mounted. Why, she owes this house and the rings on her fingers to my father's brains. When Uncle Robert married her, she didn't have a penny. They all looked at the rings as if they had a significant bearing on the situation. Edna made a gesture to take them from her hand. I guess they're not the only rings in the world, said Sloane. Oh, this is absurd, cried Edna. Anson, will you listen to me? I found out how the silly story started. It was a maid I discharged who went right to the Chillikeffs. All these Russians pump things out of their servants and then put a false meaning on them. She brought down her fist angrily on the table. And after Tom lent them the limousine for a whole month when we were south last winter. Do you see? Demanded Sloane eagerly. This maid got hold of the wrong end of the thing. She knew that Edna and I were friends, and she carried it to the Chillikeffs. In Russia, they assume that if a man and a woman... He enlarged the theme to a disquisition upon social relations in the Caucasus. If that's the case, it better be explained to Uncle Robert, said Anson dryly, so that when the rumors do reach him, he'll know they're not true. Adopting the method he had followed with Edna at luncheon, he let them explain it all away. He knew that they were guilty, and that presently they would cross the line from explanation into justification and convict themselves more definitely than he could ever do. By 7, they had taken the desperate step of telling him the truth. Robert Hunter's neglect, Edna's empty life, the casual dalliance that had flamed up into passion. But like so many true stories, it had the misfortune of being old, and its enfeebled body beat helplessly against the armor of Anson's will. The threat to go to Sloane's father sealed their helplessness, for the latter, a retired cotton broker out of Alabama, was a notorious fundamentalist who controlled his son by a rigid allowance and the promise that at his next vagary the allowance would stop forever. They dined at a small French restaurant, and the discussion continued. At one time, Sloane resorted to physical threats. A little later, they were both imploring him to give them time. But Anson was obdurate. He saw that Edna was breaking up, and that her spirit must not be refreshed by any renewal of their passion. At 2:00 in a small nightclub on 53rd Street, Edna's nerves suddenly collapsed, and she cried to go home. Sloane had been drinking heavily all evening, and he was faintly maudlin, leaning on the table and weeping a little with his face in his hands. Quickly, Anson gave them his terms. Sloane was to leave town for 6 months, and he must be gone within 48 hours. When he returned, there was to be no resumption of the affair, but at the end of a year, Edna might, if she wished, tell Robert Hunter that she wanted a divorce and go about it in the usual way. He paused, gaining confidence from their faces for his final word. Or, there's another thing you can do, he said slowly. If Edna wants to leave her children, there's nothing I can do to prevent your running off together. I want to go home, cried Edna again. Oh, haven't you done enough to us for one day? Outside it was dark, save for a blurred glow from 6th Avenue down the street. In that light, those two who had been lovers looked for the last time into each other's tragic faces, realizing that between them there was not enough youth and strength to avert their eternal parting. Sloane walked suddenly off down the street, and Anson tapped a dozing taxi driver on the arm. It was almost 4. There was a patient flow of cleaning water along the ghostly pavement of 5th Avenue, and the shadows of 2 night women flitted over the dark facade of St. Thomas's Church. Then the desolate shrubbery of Central Park, where Anson had often played as a child, and the mounting numbers, significant as names of the marching streets. This was his city, he thought, where his name had flourished through 5 generations. No change could alter the permanence of its place here, for change itself was the essential substratum by which he and those of his name identified themselves with the spirit of New York. Resourcefulness and a powerful will, for his threats in weaker hands would have been less than nothing, had beaten the gathering dust from his uncle's name, from the name of his family, from even this shivering figure that sat beside him in the car. Carrie Sloane's body was found next morning on the lower shelf of a pillar of Queensborough Bridge. In the darkness, and in his excitement, he had thought that it was the water flowing black beneath him, but in less than a second it made no possible difference, unless he had planned to think one less thought of Edna and call out her name as he struggled feebly in the water. 7. Anson never blamed himself for his part in this affair. The situation which brought it about had not been of his making. But the just suffer with the unjust, and he found that his oldest and somehow his most precious friendship was over. He never knew what distorted story Edna told, but he was welcome in his uncle's house no longer. Just before Christmas, Mrs. Hunter retired to a select Episcopal heaven, and Anson became the responsible head of his family. An unmarried aunt who had lived with them for years ran the house, and attempted with helpless inefficiency to chaperone the younger girls. All the children were less self-reliant than Anson, more conventional both in their virtues and in their shortcomings. Mrs. Hunter's death had postponed the debut of one daughter and the wedding of another. Also, it had taken something deeply material from all of them, for with her passing, the quiet, expensive superiority of the Hunters came to an end. For one thing, the estate, considerably diminished by 2 inheritance taxes and soon to be divided among 6 children, was not a notable fortune anymore. Anson saw a tendency in his youngest sisters to speak rather respectfully of families that hadn't existed 20 years ago. His own feeling of precedence was not echoed in them. Sometimes they were conventionally snobbish, that was all. For another thing, this was the last summer they would spend on the Connecticut estate. The clamor against it was too loud. Who wants to waste the best months of the year shut up in that dead old town? Reluctantly, he yielded. The house would go into the market in the fall, and next summer they would rent a smaller place in Westchester County. It was a step down from the expensive simplicity of his father's idea, and while he sympathized with the revolt, it also annoyed him. During his mother's lifetime, he had gone up there at least every other weekend, even in the gayest summers. Yet he himself was part of this change, and his strong instinct for life had turned him in his 20s from the hollow obsequies of that abortive leisure class. He did not see this clearly. He still felt that there was a norm, a standard of society, but there was no norm. It was doubtful if there had ever been a true norm in New York. The few who still paid and fought to enter a particular set succeeded only to find that as a society it scarcely functioned. Or, what was more alarming, that the bohemia from which they fled sat above them at table. At 29, Anson's chief concern was his own growing loneliness. He was sure now that he would never marry. The number of weddings at which he had officiated as best man or usher was past all counting. There was a drawer at home that bulged with the official neckties of this or that wedding party, neckties standing for romances that had not endured a year, for couples who had passed completely from his life. Scarf pins, gold pencils, cuff buttons, presents from a generation of grooms had passed through his jewel box and been lost. And with every ceremony, he was less and less able to imagine himself in the groom's place. Under his hearty goodwill toward all those marriages, there was despair about his own. And as he neared 30, he became not a little depressed at the inroads that marriage, especially lately, had made upon his friendships. Groups of people had a disconcerting tendency to dissolve and disappear. The men from his own college, and it was upon them he had expended the most time and affection, were the most elusive of all. Most of them were drawn deep into domesticity. 2 were dead, 1 lived abroad, 1 was in Hollywood writing continuities for pictures that Anson went faithfully to see. Most of them, however, were permanent commuters with an intricate family life centering around some suburban country club, and it was from these that he felt his estrangement most keenly. In the early days of their married life, they had all needed him. He gave them advice about their slim finances. He exercised their doubts about the advisability of bringing a baby into 2 rooms and a bath. Especially, he stood for the great world outside. But now their financial troubles were in the past, and the fearfully expected child had evolved into an absorbing family. They were always glad to see old Anson, but they dressed up for him and tried to impress him with their present importance and keep their troubles to themselves. They needed him no longer. A few weeks before his 30th birthday, the last of his early and intimate friends was married. Anson acted in his usual role of best man, gave his usual silver tea service, and went down to the usual Homeric to say goodbye. It was a hot Friday afternoon in May, and as he walked from the pier, he realized that Saturday closing had begun, and he was free until Monday morning. Go where? He asked himself. The Yale Club, of course. Bridge until dinner, then 4 or 5 raw cocktails in somebody's room, and a pleasant confused evening. He regretted that this afternoon's room wouldn't be along. They had always been able to cram so much into such nights. They knew how to attach women and how to get rid of them, how much consideration any girl deserved from their intelligent hedonism. A party was an adjusted thing. You took certain girls to certain places and spent just so much on their amusement. You drank a little, not much, more than you ought to drink, and at a certain time in the morning you stood up and said you were going home. You avoided college boys, sponges, future engagements, fights, sentiment, and indiscretions. This was the way it was done. All the rest was dissipation. In the morning, you were never violently sorry. You made no resolutions. But if you had overdone it and your heart was slightly out of order, you went on the wagon for a few days without saying anything about it, and waited until an accumulation of nervous boredom projected you into another party. The lobby of the Yale Club was unpopulated. In the bar, 3 very young alumni looked up at him, momentarily and without curiosity. "Hello there, Oscar," he said to the bartender. "Mr. Cahill been around this afternoon?" "Mr. Cahill's gone to New Haven." "Oh, that's so. Gone to the ball game. Lot of men gone up." Anson looked once again into the lobby, considered for a moment, and then walked out and over to Fifth Avenue. From the broad window of one of his clubs, one that he had scarcely visited in 5 years, a grey man with watery eyes stared down at him. Anson looked quickly away. That figure sitting in vacant resignation, in supercilious solitude, depressed him. He stopped and, retracing his steps, started over 47th Street toward Teak Warden's apartment. Teak and his wife had once been his most familiar friends. It was a household where he and Dolly Carger had been used to go in the days of their affair. But Teak had taken to drink, and his wife had remarked publicly that Anson was a bad influence on him. The remark reached Anson in an exaggerated form. When it was finally cleared up, the delicate spell of intimacy was broken, never to be renewed. "Is Mr. Warden at home?" he inquired. "They've gone to the country." The fact unexpectedly cut at him. They were gone to the country, and he hadn't known. 2 years before, he would have known the date, the hour, come up at the last moment for a final drink, and planned his first visit to them. Now they had gone without a word. Anson looked at his watch and considered a weekend with his family, but the only train was a local that would jolt through the aggressive heat for 3 hours. And tomorrow in the country and Sunday, he was in no mood for porch bridge with polite undergraduates and dancing after dinner at a rural roadhouse, a diminutive of gaiety which his father had estimated too well. "Oh, no," he said to himself. "No." He was a dignified, impressive young man, rather stout now, but otherwise unmarked by dissipation. He could have been cast for a pillar of something, At times you were sure it was not society, at others nothing else. For the law, for the church. He stood for a few minutes motionless on the sidewalk in front of a 47th Street apartment house. For almost the first time in his life, he had nothing whatever to do. Then he began to walk briskly up Fifth Avenue, as if he had just been reminded of an important engagement there. The necessity of dissimulation is one of the few characteristics that we share with dogs, and I think of Anson on that day as some well-bred specimen who had been disappointed at a familiar back door. He was going to see Nick, once a fashionable bartender in demand at all private dances, and now employed in cooling non-alcoholic champagne among the labyrinthine cellars of the Plaza Hotel. "Nick," he said, "what's happened to everything?" "Dead," Nick said. "Make me a whiskey sour." Anson handed a pint bottle over the counter. "Nick, the girls are different. I had a little girl in Brooklyn and she got married last week without letting me know." "That's a fact?" responded Nick diplomatically. "Slipped it over on you." "Absolutely," said Anson, "and I was out with her the night before." "Ha ha ha," said Nick. "Ha ha ha." "Do you remember the wedding, Nick, in Hot Springs, where I had the waiters and the musicians singing God Save the King?" "Now where was that, Mr. Hunter?" Nick concentrated doubtfully. "Seems to me that was next time they were back for more, and I began to wonder how much I'd paid them," continued Anson. "Seems to me that was at Mr. Trenholm's wedding." "Don't know him," said Anson decisively. He was offended that a strange name should intrude upon his reminiscences. Nick perceived this. He admitted. "I ought to know that. It was one of your crowd. Braken's Bicker, said Anson responsively. "They put me in a hearse after it was over and covered me up with flowers and drove me away." "Ha ha ha," said Nick. "Ha ha ha." Nick's simulation of the old family servant paled presently, and Anson went upstairs to the lobby. He looked around. His eyes met the glance of an unfamiliar clerk at the desk, then fell upon a flower from the morning's marriage hesitating in the mouth of a brass cuspidor. He went out and walked slowly toward the blood-red sun over Columbus Circle. Suddenly he turned around and, retracing his steps to the plaza, immured himself in a telephone booth. Later, he said that he tried to get me 3 times that afternoon, that he tried everyone who might be in New York, men and girls he had not seen for years, an artist's model of his college days whose faded number was still in his address book. Central told him that even the exchange existed no longer. At length his quest roved into the country, and he held brief, disappointing conversations with emphatic butlers and maids. "So-and-so was out, riding, swimming, playing golf, sailed to Europe last week. Who shall I say phoned?" It was intolerable that he should pass the evening alone. The private reckonings which one plans for a moment of leisure lose every charm when the solitude is enforced. There were always women of a sort, but the ones he knew had temporarily vanished, and to pass a New York evening in the hired company of a stranger never occurred to him. He would have considered that that was something shameful and secret, the diversion of a traveling salesman in a strange town. Anson paid the telephone bill. The girl tried unsuccessfully to joke with him about its size, and for the second time that afternoon started to leave the plaza and go he knew not where. Near the revolving door, the figure of a woman, obviously with child, stood sideways to the light. A sheer beige cape fluttered at her shoulders when the door turned, and, each time, she looked impatiently toward it as if she were weary of waiting. At the first sight of her, a strong, nervous thrill of familiarity went over him, but not until he was within 5 feet of her did he realize that it was Paula. "Why, Anson Hunter!" His heart turned over. "Why, Paula! Why, this is wonderful! I can't believe it! Anson!" She took both his hands, and he saw in the freedom of the gesture that the memory of him had lost poignancy to her. but not to him. He felt that old mood that she evoked in him stealing over his brain, that gentleness with which he had always met her optimism, as if afraid to mar its surface. "We're at Rye for the summer. Pete had to come east on business. You know, of course, I'm Mrs. Peter Haggerty now. So we brought the children and took a house. You've got to come out and see us." "Can I?" he asked directly. "When?" "When you like. Here's Pete." The revolving door functioned, giving up a fine tall man of 30 with a tanned face and a trim mustache. His immaculate fitness made a sharp contrast with Anson's increasing bulk, which was obvious under the faintly tight cutaway coat. "You oughtn't to be standing," said Haggerty to his wife. "Let's sit down here." He indicated lobby chairs, but Paula hesitated. "I've got to go right home," she said. "Anson, why don't you come out and have dinner with us tonight? We're just getting settled, but if you can stand that." Haggerty confirmed the invitation cordially. "Come out for the night." Their car waited in front of the hotel, and Paula, with a tired gesture, sank back against silk cushions in the corner. "There's so much I want to talk to you about," she said. "It seems hopeless." "I want to hear about you." "Well," she smiled at Haggerty, "that would take a long time, too. I have 3 children by my first marriage. The oldest is 5, then 4, then 3. She smiled again. "I didn't waste much time having them, did I?" "Boys?" "A boy and 2 girls. Then, a lot of things happened, and I got a divorce in Paris a year ago and married Pete. That's all, except that I'm awfully happy." In Rye, they drove up to a large house near the beach club, from which there issued presently 3 dark, slim children who broke from an English governess and approached them with an esoteric cry. Abstractedly, and with difficulty, Paula took each one into her arms, a caress which they accepted stiffly, as they had evidently been told not to bump into Mummy. Even against their fresh faces, Paula's skin showed scarcely any weariness. For all her physical languor, she seemed younger than when he had last seen her at Palm Beach 7 years ago. At dinner, she was preoccupied, and afterward, during the homage to the radio, she lay with closed eyes on the sofa, until Anson wondered if his presence at this time were not an intrusion. But at 9 o'clock, when Haggerty rose and said pleasantly that he was going to leave them by themselves for a while, she began to talk slowly about herself and the past. "My first baby," she said, "the one we called Darling, the biggest little girl. I wanted to die when I knew I was going to have her, because Lowell was like a stranger to me. It didn't seem as though she could be my own. I wrote you a letter and tore it up. Oh, you were so bad to me, Anson." It was the dialogue again, rising and falling. Anson felt a sudden quickening of memory. "Weren't you engaged once?" she asked. "A girl named Dolly something." "I wasn't ever engaged. I tried to be engaged, but I never loved anybody but you, Paula." "Oh," she said. Then, after a moment, "This baby is the first one I ever really wanted. You see, I'm in love now, at last." He didn't answer, shocked at the treachery of her remembrance. She must have seen that the "at last" bruised him, for she continued. "I was infatuated with you, Anson. You could make me do anything you liked, but we wouldn't have been happy. I'm not smart enough for you. I don't like things to be complicated like you do." She paused. "You'll never settle down," she said. The phrase struck at him from behind. It was an accusation that of all accusations he had never merited. "I could settle down if women were different," he said. "If I didn't understand so much about them, if women didn't spoil you for other women, if they had only a little pride, if I could go to sleep for a while and wake up into a home that was really mine, why, that's what I'm made for, Paula. That's what women have seen in me and liked in me. It's only that I can't get through the preliminaries anymore." Haggerty came in a little before 11. After a whiskey, Paula stood up and announced that she was going to bed. She went over and stood by her husband. "Where did you go, dearest?" she demanded. "I had a drink with Ed Saunders." "I was worried. I thought maybe you'd run away." She rested her head against his coat. "He's sweet, isn't he, Anson?" she demanded. "Absolutely," said Anson, laughing. She raised her face to her husband. "Well, I'm ready," she said. She turned to Anson. "Do you want to see our family gymnastics stunt?" "Yes," he said in an interested voice. "All right, here we go." Haggerty picked her up easily in his arms. "This is called the family acrobatic stunt," said Paula. "He carries me upstairs. Isn't it sweet of him?" "Yes," said Anson. Haggerty bent his head slightly until his face touched Paula's. "And I love him," she said. "I've just been telling you, haven't I, Anson?" "Yes," he said. "He's the dearest thing that ever lived in this world, aren't you, darling? Well, good night. Here we go. Isn't he strong?" "Yes," Anson said. "You'll find a pair of Pete's pajamas laid out for you. Sweet dreams. See you at breakfast." "Yes," Anson said. 8. The older members of the firm insisted that Anson should go abroad for the summer. He had scarcely had a vacation in 7 years, they said. He was stale and needed a change. Anson resisted. "If I go," he declared, "I won't come back anymore." "That's absurd, old man. You'll be back in 3 months with all this depression gone, fit as ever." "No." He shook his head stubbornly. "If I stop, I won't go back to work. If I stop, that means I've given up. I'm through." "We'll take a chance on that. Stay 6 months if you like. We're not afraid you'll leave us. Why, you'd be miserable if you didn't work." They arranged his passage for him. They liked Anson. Everyone liked Anson, and the change that had been coming over him cast a sort of pall over the office. The enthusiasm that had invariably signaled up business, the consideration toward his equals and his inferiors, the lift of his vital presence. Within the past 4 months, his intense nervousness had melted down these qualities into the fussy pessimism of a man of 40. On every transaction in which he was involved, he acted as a drag and a strain. "If I go, I'll never come back," he said. 3 days before he sailed, Paula Legendre Haggerty died in childbirth. I was with him a great deal then, for we were crossing together, but for the first time in our friendship he told me not a word of how he felt, nor did I see the slightest sign of emotion. His chief preoccupation was with the fact that he was 30 years old. He would turn the conversation to the point where he could remind you of it, and then fall silent, as if he assumed that the statement would start a chain of thought sufficient to itself. Like his partners, I was amazed at the change in him, and I was glad when the Paris moved off into the wet space between the worlds, leaving his principality behind. "How about a drink?" he suggested. We walked into the bar with that defiant feeling that characterizes the day of departure, and ordered 4 martinis. After 1 cocktail, a change came over him. He suddenly reached across and slapped my knee with the first joviality I had seen him exhibit for months. "Did you see that girl in the red tam?" he demanded. "The one with the high color who had the 2 police dogs down to bid her goodbye?" "She's pretty," I agreed. "I looked her up in the purser's office and found out that she's alone. I'm going down to see the steward in a few minutes. We'll have dinner with her tonight." After a while, he left me, and within an hour he was walking up and down the deck with her, talking to her in his strong, clear voice. Her red tam was a bright spot of color against the steel-green sea, and from time to time she looked up with a flashing bob of her head and smiled with amusement and interest and anticipation. At dinner we had champagne, and we were very joyous. Afterward, Anson ran the pool with infectious gusto, and several people who had seen me with him asked me his name. He and the girl were talking and laughing together on a lounge in the bar when I went to bed. I saw less of him on the trip than I had hoped. He wanted to arrange a foursome, but there was no one available, so I saw him only at meals. Sometimes, though, he would have a cocktail in the bar, and he told me about the girl in the red tam and his adventures with her, making them all bizarre and amusing, as he had a way of doing, and I was glad that he was himself again, or at least the self that I knew and with which I felt at home. I don't think he was ever happy unless someone was in love with him, responding to him like filings to a magnet, helping him to explain himself, promising him something. What it was, I do not know. Perhaps they promised that there would always be women in the world who would spend their brightest, freshest, rarest hours to nurse and protect that superiority he cherished in his heart. End of section 2.